Hello, and welcome to our third installment of our Care4Clergy Panel Discussion. We are looking at the pernicious problem of racism, prejudice, and intolerance, its effects on ministers and ministry in a local and global context. We're hoping with this discussion to give ministers insights into the broader context of these problems and some tools with which to face both the prejudice of our own hearts and that of our congregations in a loving, healthy, and compassionate way. I will invite the panelists for today to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, I'm Nicola Brady. I'm the General Secretary of the Irish Council of Churches. My role involves bringing together Christian church leaders across the island of Ireland for relationship building, dialogue and collaboration on issues of shared concern. Our mission statement is Churches in Ireland Connecting in Christ, and that reflects the commitment to unity and diversity that is at the heart of all that we do, which I think is very relevant to our discussions today, and really happy to be a part of the conversation. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here, Nicola.
Hey everybody, my name is John Boopalan. I currently serve as a minister of an American Baptist church in the Boston area in the state of Massachusetts, so that's northeastern United States. I'm from India. I'm from the south of India, and I am Dalit, which means that I share the heritage of a people who have been historically both called and treated as untouchables. And my parents also come from two different language groups. In India, states are divided linguistically, so if you move from one state to the other, you're moving really into foreign territory, as it were. So they come from two states, two different linguistics groups, and as a matter of fact, also two different caste groups that were historically antagonistic. Grew up in the south of India for the most part, got my theological degree in India, and I have been in the United States for the last 10 years. And I belong to a collective called the Collective of Dalit Ecumenical Christian Scholars. And we are people spread around the world, and we think about forms of discrimination. And our starting point, the starting point of discrimination that we start off conversations with is, of course, the caste context in India. And we use that as a launching point to then talk about discrimination in different parts of the world. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll say more during the conversation.
Thank you, John.
Good, and it's good to be here with Nicola and John. Livingstone Thompson is my name, and I am a Moravian minister. I'm based in Belfast. I come originally from Jamaica, and I now serve two congregations in Northern Ireland, and having served in Jamaica for some time, part of the work that I do now includes being a part of the executive board of the Moravian Church, but also I am closely connected and work with the Africa Support Organization of Northern Ireland, which is a kind of a, well, it is the leading migrant-led organization in Northern Ireland. And would be the, we may say, the main instrument of enabling integration and also raising issues relating to the experience of Black and minority ethnic people, but more so Black people in Northern Ireland. So that is a little bit about what I do. My from a theological training point of view, my emphasis has been in the area of world religions, and so I bring that to as part of the background from which I speak, having grown up in Jamaica in the rural area. It is the starting point of my own analysis, so that becomes important for how I read power, how I understand also what it means to be, what it means, well, in a hierarchical society, what it means. I take pride in the fact that my paternal grandmother carries the name Serf, because that was the name that was given to her because of the heritage of serving. And so the whole idea of name and how that connects to history of enslavement is something which is particularly important to me. So that's part of what I bring.
Thank you very much, Brother Livingston. As we continue this conversation, another main point that I didn't mention at the start is also dealing with members of our congregations who have suffered from prejudice, who have experienced it themselves. And as ministers, we're trying to help them find healing, find a safe place, and find a way forward in the midst of this kind of pain. And also ministers themselves have suffered discrimination of various kinds. So I think that should be one area of focus. But as we begin the conversation, let's start with the main question. What is prejudice? What is discrimination, intolerance, racism, these things? And how do we identify them?
Well, I'm happy to make a start at it. I usually, one of the stock in trade stories that I tell is how prejudice is really a normal part of human experience. That story relates to a situation in the Republic of Ireland, where one Friday evening I was hurrying. It was just after dusk. I was hurrying to pick up my car from the mechanic, and which is walking distance from our home, but it was in November, so it's a little at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock even in November. It's quite dark. So as I just went around the corner from my house, just ahead of me was what appeared to me to be a young, maybe 11-year-old girl. Now, I had no idea who she was or where she was coming from. I was hurrying to get my car. It just so happened that she was ahead of me and she was hurrying. And the more I hurried, the more she hurried. And I started realizing that she may have been thinking that I was hurrying after her. And but because the station was going to be closing, I didn't preoccupy myself too much with the implication. But as I hurried more, so she hurried more, and she started to run. And I've always wondered, when she went home, did she say to her mother, her parents, that a black man was chasing her, was running after her? And would she have a good reason to come to the conclusion that she must run for safety? She was making what you call a prejudgment. And that prejudgment is exactly what we mean when we say prejudice. Now, it's important to know that this girl was justified in making taking a decision about safety. She may have heard stories about men having hurt girls. She may even have heard stories about black men hurting girls. So it was completely fair for her. In a situation where you are uncertain, you don't have time to negotiate. I mean, it would be very foolish of her, if I'm going to hurt her, for her to stop and say, "Are you going to hurt me?" I usually hear that men can hurt. "Are you going to hurt me?" In a situation of judgment, you do not negotiate. You make judgment on the basis of experience and on the basis of knowledge and on the basis of what is presented to you at the time. So prejudice is something that is very normal in human experience. So what is the problem with prejudice? The problem with prejudice is when individuals do not know that they have the prejudice. They do not know that they are deploying the prejudgment in a way that is unfair. So back to the story. If in that story, she would still be prepared to hold on to the view that that was what was happening, even when the information is presented as that not being the case, if she held on to it, the prejudgment now becomes what we may call calcified prejudice, because she's not prepared to let go of what she has, what she perceived, even in light of information. So that, in a sense, is the problem with prejudice. The fact that people make prejudgment, the fact that people have attitudes relating to groups of people and others based on their experience and their knowledge is understandable. It's not necessarily fair, but it's understandable. The question is, am I prepared to rethink my attitude in light of information? So when I begin now to engage with the travelers, do I then realize that what people say about travelers, a group in Ireland that is particularly discriminated against, am I prepared now to adjust my thinking, even if the second traveler I met reinforced the experience of the first? Am I still prepared in the third to say it is not necessarily so? So the challenge then with prejudice is to be able to let go of your prejudgment in light of experience and so on, that, and not to make a group of people to carry the burden of the bad experience of one. That, I think, is important to appreciate when we talk about prejudice.
Thank you, Livingstone. Anyone want to respond or carry on the conversation?
Well, I think, to take that a step further, I absolutely agree with all of that. I think that's a really helpful way in, and the question itself, I think, identifies for us one of the problems, that there is so much terminology for people to get their heads around. Sometimes it can be difficult to get a clear understanding of what the problem is. And Livingstone's example gives people a way of bringing it down to the level of everyday human experience. And I think that's so important. And from the perspective of the local church and what we're trying to achieve, it's really important to focus on the consequences of all these things and what we're trying to address. And that is about the things that exclude and marginalize and hurt people, and all those barriers to people's sense of belonging, that these are the kinds of things that we're trying to address through this work.
Thank you, Nicola.
I'm happy to also just add a little bit there. In my own work, I've found it far more helpful to think about things like discrimination, prejudice, or racism, or any number of things as not simply things that people believe, but as things that people in fact do. There's a really good book titled Doing Race, which talks about how forms of discrimination, forms of prejudice are better understood as things that people do with their bodies, what we do with our bodies. So you'll hear this as a recurring theme in the conversation today, is the particular lens that I bring to this conversation is to just notice what we are doing with our bodies. And this is why I actually appreciated your example, Livingstone, is that we do things with our bodies, right? So here's a person in front of you running away from a black body, right? Here's a white body conditioned to think particular things about black bodies, especially black bodies that move, right? If you're a black body and you're stationary, that's one thing. But if you're a black body and moving, especially moving towards a white body, things begin to happen. So I would say, for me, based on my own kind of thinking and research, I much prefer to understand and explain racism, prejudice, and discrimination are things that people do with their bodies. And I'll simply offer one example and then stop and then look forward to the conversation. Kelly Brown Douglas, who is a womanist theologian here in the United States, in her book, Stand Your Ground, writes of her experience with her 2-year-old son. Okay, Kelly Brown Douglas is dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And she's describing her encounter in a public park with her 2-year-old son. Kelly Brown Douglas is black and her son is black, and they're in the public park. Her 2-year-old son is playing in one of those, car-looking things in the public park. And as he's there just playing, there are 2 white boys who are not more than 7 or 8 years old, right? 2 white boys who are not more than 7 or 8 years old. And they come running towards Kelly Brown Douglas's 2-year-old son. And he is understandably scared, right? and he's just looking at them because they're running towards him. So he's looking at them. And the 2 7, 8-year-old boys look at this 2-year-old boy and tell him, you better stop looking at us or we'll put you in jail where you belong, right? Now, this is an encounter between a 2-year-old black boy who's being watched by his black mother, and 2 7-year, 8-year-old white boys, right? And so the question that arises is, are these 2 7, 8-year-old boys racist? Are they racist? Do they believe certain things about the world, which in fact they might do, right? Which in fact they might do. They might actually be conditioned to think about these things in very particular ways. But I'm also more interested in examining what it is about their bodies that enables them to do these things in that way. How do these bodies actually interact with one another in collective social life? So I could talk endlessly about these things, but let me stop there and say that prejudice, discrimination, racism, one way to understand that is simply as things that people do based on the ways that their social imagination has been formed by particular context, particular history, time, place, and so on. Yeah.
So there's a certain physicality to prejudice. There's the boundaries that we set aren't just in our heads or in our hearts, but the boundaries we set are physical, and we respond in this. Is that what you're saying, John?
Very much so. That they're actually tactile is what I'm saying. Yes, it's not simply it's like a both and. I don't want to make it an either or, right? It's not an either or. It's always far more complex than that, but it's certainly also tactile.
Anybody want to continue with this, or should we move to the next question? Livingston?
Yes, I mean, I can appreciate the idea of things that we actually do, because there is a component of prejudice, there's a component of racism, which is also about power, which I think needs to, in a sense, be understood, that there is a connection between belief and power that creates the possibility for an incident you may call a racial incident. So the thing that I use as a kind of a way to get into it is what I call the racial arithmetic. And in this racial arithmetic, I say belief plus prejudice plus power equals racial incident. People can believe whatever they want. They're free to, it's a free country, believe whatever you want. You're not actually as able to portray prejudice as you want, because as in this case, certainly here in the EU, we have grounds on which discrimination, we have protected grounds, 9 grounds, that there's a protection. So the people may hold the prejudice. So I may have a certain way of thinking about gay. I may have a way of thinking about women, etc. Or, so gender is, but I'm not allowed under law to behave as I like. So why is it then that despite legislation, why do we get a racial incident or a situation of discrimination? And that is because of power or perception of power. When an individual has the perception that they're in a position of power to put their belief and their prejudice to deploy, or if you want to put it in more business term, to leverage their power and their prejudice, that's when you get a racial situation or a situation of discrimination actually that is actualized. So I think, again, John, this idea of movement, in a sense, can be probably discerned through it, but I put a lot of weight on power. And I suppose if we had time, we would probably understand that the whole idea of discrimination, and certainly racism as we understand it, it has as its fundamental root an economic power. Is fundamental to the practice of racism. And as it happens today, whether it's in systemic racism, the way in which a country or organization conducts itself, follow the money, I say, follow the money. Who is benefiting economically from these structures? It is never without economic benefit. And I think people not appreciating that there is a power about money and privilege, and hence economic benefit that's associated with it, I think miss the point about the unfairness of racism.
This comes on to the next concept in Northern Ireland, in Ireland across the board. There's plenty of prejudice to go around there. There's many divisions within society, and it's very complex. It's complicated, and some of these are very old, and some of them are not so old. But it's complicated and is expressed in many ways. Where does, and I think we've touched on this a bit, but really let's explore it a bit more. In where does this kind of prejudice arise from? Livingstone says it suggests that it comes out of this power dynamic, this sense of it is an economic element involved, but where does it come from? Like how does it get a foothold in society, especially as is expressed in our context?
Well, I think John made reference to the point about prejudice as being formed in a particular context, and on the island of Ireland and in Northern Ireland especially, we have a particular lived experience here around divided communities that has certainly shaped the way people's opinions around society and what it means to be a community have been formed. And that has an impact on the context in which our approach to wider issues of racism and global justice take place. And I think one of the things that the churches have been trying to do in their work around tackling sectarianism and pointing out how sectarianism has now, in some cases, evolved into forms of racism and other forms of exclusion as well, is pointing out how damaging this dominant narrative of two communities in Northern Ireland has been, because we have been so focused on the experience of Protestants and Catholics that in itself has involved a lot of stereotyping, labeling of people. It has not left a lot of space for those people who don't fit comfortably into either of the two dominant community narratives. But then there are whole other sections of society of people who just don't fit those labels, that have felt excluded and left behind. So when it comes to our particular understanding of these issues, I think that has to be an important starting point for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I am particularly naturally interested and have to think about the situation here in Northern Ireland. But one of the things that I have noticed is the kinds of solutions that have been developed over the years in responding to sectarianism. the larger percentage of the interventions, it's financial. I need to take a drink of water. So John, you can come in and say, I'll come back and say something. Yeah, but the larger percentage of the intervention, it's financial. So we have, for example, the many years of the peace funding as a way of helping to manage the consequences or to rectify what is perceived to be the disquiet between the communities. And the fundamental assumption is that the presence of the other is a threat to the well-being of the one. That is what is the prejudice. And it has a historical root that the presence of another group here puts a threat to our well-being and our wealth, essentially. And the way in which then life gets organized is about those who are close to the benefit and those who are far from the benefit. So I say again that there is a correlationship between prejudice and money, which I am happy always to express.
Thank you, Livingston.
I think Livingston, I mean, I actually am on the same page there, that, you know, when we follow the money and when we follow power, it leads us to places where we actually are able to put our fingers on, you know, things like prejudice and racism and discrimination. It's all right there. So I'm actually with you in that kind of understanding. To take another shot in responding to the question, where do these things come from? How did they come about, right? Oftentimes people, and I'm not saying all, right? You know, the nature of the world is such that some of us think about this all the time, and some of us think about this none of the time. And then some of us think about these things during COVID-19 or during ad hoc special occasions, right? It's just the nature of things. But to respond to the question, particularly, where do these things come from? Oftentimes, I feel like one popular kind of response to that question is, it's just the way things are. It's just the way things are. People have always fought with each other. People will always find some way to create hierarchies. It's just the way things are, and it's just the way things will be. And in that statement, I feel like there are two problems. One is there's a certain resignation, right? It's almost as if I did not have anything to do with this, right? And the fact that remains is whether we, as individuals or communities, do something or not, we are all part of the problem in some one way or another, right? So by saying it's just the way things are, what it does is that it creates a certain indifference, it creates a certain apathy, and it also legitimizes a certain complicity, a possible complicity in systems of oppression, right? By saying it's just the way things are. And the other thing that it actually does, and this is where I want to go back to what Livingston said, is it actually does not follow the money and the power, right? It actually does not do that. By saying it's just the way things are, we are actually not following histories. We're not following channels of finance. We're not following channels of power. In the United States context, for instance, even today in history textbooks, middle schoolers and high schoolers are taught that segregation today is like de facto, right? It's just the way things are. And if there is any complexification of that kind of problem, then people would say something like, and these are history textbooks, we're talking about public school history textbooks, right? People would say something like, well, you know, yeah, there was some structural problem in the sense that, you know, loans were predatory, and banks kind of discriminated people, and that led to some differences in segregation, and some of the problems that we have might be associated with that. So there's a little bit of following the money and the power there. but not taking it to its logical conclusion. And the fact of the matter remains that in the United States, segregation was not simply de facto, but de jure. It was legitimized by law. And just in case hearers are thinking, and I'm making this up, one book to read is Richard Rothstein's Color of Law, where he really gets into this particular phenomenon. But to answer your question more directly, Jared, after having offered this example, is to simply say that these things come from places, from contexts, and we need to have an understanding of who we are as not simply as persons who just appear in the world without any kind of baggage, but as people who actually come with some very, very heavy baggage into the world. Right? I think that, and this is what people in social theory would call social location, that we are not simply neutral persons. We come as being marked by time, by gender, by race, by a sense of place, by denominational identities, right? By particular sexual gender identities, by racial identities. All of these things comprise who we are. And so we come from certain places and we bring our baggage with us. And and to go back to what some of the things that Livingstone was saying, we deploy that, right? We deploy that in ways that we are aware of, and we deploy that in ways that we are not aware of. And therefore, things like bodies come into the conversation there. Yeah, let me stop there. Yeah.
Mm.
Thank you very much. So in some ways, Livingstone gave an example of how prejudice is expressed, and John, you gave an example as well. But in everyday life for people, we are experiencing this prejudice either on our behalf or negative prejudice of some sort. We're responding to it instinctively. So how can we talk about that? How it's expressed in our everyday lives as especially in the context of ministry and leadership?
Yeah. I don't know if you, Nicola, want to go first. I mean, I'm happy to go. Yeah.
No, after you, let's mix it up a little bit.
Yeah. It is helpful that, and I mean, this is one of the strategies I know that have been employed, where individuals simply tell the stories that they're carrying about who they are and what they have heard about the other, just to tell those stories. And not to try to make judgment of the stories, but just to tell the story as you have heard it, as you have come to own it, about yourself and about others. And then to listen to the story that others have, stories about who we are and how we came to be. And I think that is a way in which we begin to enter this space of being able to engage with it. So there is an honesty in sharing, and there is a kind of a willingness, a kind of a imperative almost to listen, to hear what the other's story is. Because it is in hearing those other stories, we learn the art of counter-narrative. If we do not hear the story being genuinely and in an honest way being told, we do not enter into it does not give us what we may call the language for the counter-narrative. And the way in which we overcome the things we hold is being able to find the words, the vocabulary to speak about the reality in a different way. So if there's one thing I would recommend, and certainly something that I would value for my own church community and otherwise, tell me the story. Tell me a little bit about what you have heard and what you feel and what you think, and others get a chance to do so. Developing the art of counter-narrative is such a critical part of this engaging with the sectarianism and prejudice people hold.
So if I can add to that from our experience in an inter-church context, we think, as I said at the beginning, you know, our approach is one of unity and diversity, and appreciating what we gain from what the different traditions and people's cultural backgrounds brings to the table. And that in itself, you know, when churches make those kind of visible statements in the community, is an important form of leadership. And then building on that, to also recognize the resources that churches have. First and foremost, the examples and the teachings that we bring from Scripture, which very clearly emphasizes things like hospitality, welcoming the stranger, you know, our common humanity, the fact that everyone who needs me is my neighbor. And so to build on that, one of the things that we did in an interchurch context a number of years ago was draw together a set of affirmations that all our member churches signed up to around inclusion, you know, inclusion particularly of people from different racial and ethnic minority backgrounds. So a statement of the core biblical principles that we all share that inform how we approach these conversations. And then building on that, we started to look critically around representation, who was not represented, what more could we do to be more proactive in bringing people into the conversation. And there are different levels to that. And the point that Livingstone makes around listening is really important, and how those conversations are framed so that people feel that there's a safe space for sharing. Research, finding out who is actually in our local communities, where people are coming from, having access to good quality information. Educating ourselves as church communities and pointing people to where resources are available, so that we can talk about issues like racism and prejudice with good informed content, and in a way that helps people to develop those critical tools to evaluate their own thinking, to ask those questions around power structures and who's benefiting, in a way that doesn't resort to blame and shame, but guiding people in a supportive way with those positive values of where we want to get to before us. And we found in some of the previous research that we did that the whole concept of belonging was central to that as a church community. So how we communicate that sense of welcome and belonging, and that based on that there were some very specific actions that churches could take. So from how you physically demonstrate that welcome from the moment that people appear in the door of the church, so things like having posters up saying welcome in a range of different languages, and languages that maybe reflect the composition of the surrounding community. Then being proactive in reaching out to people who've been hurt, so where you know there has maybe been a racially motivated attack, finding ways that are sensitive and appropriate to reach out to people and show them that there's a community there that cares about them. Being proactive in how you talk about these issues and connecting it to different gospel themes that are coming up in worship and Bible study and other opportunities that arise in the church context. And then building on that, how you communicate in the wider community that this is what we're doing and this is what we're about in churches. And that involves building people's confidence, so that if there's something that occurs in the local community, that people from the local church have the confidence to speak up and represent the church in the public square with those positive messages about welcome and belonging and community.
So in many ways, it's being aware of your social location, right? Who's around you, what's there, and what are the resources with which we can engage is a critical tool. Thank you very much.
I really appreciate what you both have said, Nicola and Livingstone, because it's actually taking us a little bit deeper into the conversation at this point, right? Which is actually fantastic. And Jared, the way you phrased the question, I think is a really good one that, you know, I made a note of it here. We are responding to these things instinctively, right? Much of our responses are actually instinctive. And if we get ourselves and others to see that that is the case, I feel like that's a good chunk of addressing the problem, is to simply recognize that we are responding to things instinctively, right? We have gut responses to things. When we see a different body, or when we see folks from a different denomination, or when we see folks from a different social location, we have instinctive responses, right? And if we follow those thoughts, and if we follow those feelings, and ask ourselves, or just draw out a map of how exactly did I come to this particular place where I imagine these particular things, where I think these things, and I feel these things so instinctively, we really get a roadmap of, oh my God, maybe that's it. Maybe that's where the problem is, right? So in the Indian context, right, because of caste, I'll just give two examples and then come back to responding to the question very directly and then stop. In the Indian context, because of caste is very much a geographical thing, right? So if you go to a typical Indian village, a village is such an interesting word, and I'm using the English word, and the vernacular has different terms for village, right? In India, village can mean two things. One is the village as the whole village, right? But another caste-inflected meaning of the word village is that part of the village where the dominant caste communities live, right? So if you just think of these two hands as comprising the geography of a village. If this is the village, right, and this is where the dominant caste communities live, in one meaning of the word village, this is simply the village. So this part of the village where, let's say, Dalit communities live, which are actually physically separate from the places where the dominant caste live, this is not considered the village. So if you are a member of the Dalit community, you do not even belong in the conception of the village, right? So there is this us versus them difference that is kind of etched into people's thinking, into people's feeling, that is very much marked by geography, right? And so what happens today is, caste-based discrimination is a punishable offense in India. And yet it is practiced all the time. This is actually one of the paradoxes of the 21st century, right? That there are so many places in the world, almost every country in the world, where racial discrimination, caste-based discrimination are punishable offenses, right? And yet they are practiced every day, right? And one of the most difficult things to do is to prove intent. How do you prove intent? How do you prove it? We can't. In so many ways in court, we can't, and yet people feel it. People think it, right? So that's one thing that I'd want to say. So today when, let's say a Dalit person moves through the streets of a dominant caste person, dominant caste persons are looking at the Dalit persons on their streets, as it were, and thinking you don't belong. You are moving out of place, out of your historically assigned place. You are moving out of your historically assigned place, and that makes them feel certain ways, in certain ways, and they have instinctive kind of responses that are not always the most positive. They often lead to death even, and murder in the Indian context, right? So I think that the way you phrased it, Jared, is we are responding to things instinctively. If we actually paid sufficient attention to how we do that on an everyday basis, we'll get a long way in addressing discrimination, I feel. And because I identify as heterosexual male, I should say something about men, right? Now, I'm born into this world as a man, as somebody who identifies as male and heterosexual. What does that mean? What does that mean? Is that simply a matter of me saying, yes, I'm heterosexual male? Does the conversation stop there? Or should it then lead me to a place where I kind of draw a little bit of a roadmap of myself and the world, and think about my place in the world and the place of other people in the world, the place of women in the world, and then ask myself a couple of questions, right? So I'm 6'3", right? So I'm a tall guy. So when I sit in a place, I do take up some space. But as a man, I take up a little bit more space than a woman would. So if I'm sitting on the bus, I just spread my legs because that's what I do as a man, right? And I may think there's nothing wrong with that. But if I pay attention to my body and think about how much space I'm taking, then that may actually teach me a couple of things, right? In the Indian context, because patriarchy runs so deep, right? If a group of women laugh out loud, I bet you a bunch of men somewhere would ask themselves the question, even if they don't phrase it, they would think and feel, why are these bunch of women laughing so loudly? Right? Now, if a bunch of men laughed loudly, they would not think anything about it. They just keep moving. But if a bunch of women laughed loudly, the men somewhere would think and feel, where's that loud woman's voice coming from, right? And so if simply by thinking of myself as a heterosexual male person who's formed by certain conditions in the world that makes me think of men in a certain way, think of women in a certain way, helps me a whole lot, I feel. And this is the last thing I'll say, because I do want to have the conversation with each other as well. This is something that both Nicola and Livingstone have mentioned, is that the stories we tell about ourselves are so essential. So I'm completely on the same page here, right? That we are so used to telling stories about ourselves, right? That the plot never changes. The plot of the story does not change because our place in the story remains unchanged. It's always the other person's plot that has to change, but not ours, right? And so especially for people who come from dominant social locations, right? People who come from dominant social locations are so used to telling their stories in a certain way that they come out looking as a good person all the time. But there's something about telling stories that necessitates that we reconsider our plots. What are the major plots in our stories? I think is a very, very important question to ask ourselves. And why is that the plot never changes, right? I'm thinking here of the social theorist named Judith Butler, who wrote a book called Giving an Account of Ourselves. And she says, in giving accounts of ourselves, we tell stories and the plots often do not change. And maybe we should sit back and consider why those plots do not change and ask ourselves the question, are those plots then entangled with questions of gender and sexuality and race and money and power, right? I think that is just so necessary. And that would actually lead us to a place where our differences come to the surface a little bit more, right? Because talking about these things would also mean that antagonisms kind of come up a little bit to the surface. And one Catholic writer who I appreciate on this matter a little bit is G.K. Chesterton, who is a long time gone, but his writings remain. And one of the things that he says in his autobiography about him and his brother, he says, we always argued, but never fought. And I feel like, talking about the topic of today, I feel like we should argue more about these things, but not fight. How can we get ourselves to a place where we argue about these things because these things matter, but do not fight, do not let them lead to a place of an unresolvable antagonism.
Argue and not fight. I like that. And I think that in many ways the work that the ICC is involved in a lot of the churches here is that opening up the dialogue and having these healthy conversations where we listen to each other, even when we disagree with each other. And it is the only real way forward, I think. But as we are wrestling with the bigger questions and trying to find our place in the society and our role, and as John said, we do have this social location. We are either woman or man or whatever way we describe ourselves to be. We are what we are. We're Protestant, we're Catholic, we're Black, we're white, we're owning who we are and understanding who we are is the first step, and accepting who we are as we are is the first step to this ability to ask questions about the broader world around us and where we fit in. As ministers, we are facing a huge array of opinions, perspectives. We're dealing with people in many walks of life and with many different experiences. I know for myself in my congregations that I have served over the years, I have found people worshiping together who disagree thoroughly over politics and issues of race, issues of gender, all of the major questions of the day. People come to worship and mix and mingle, and as the minister, you are set to deal with all of these different people. And so how do we negotiate those boundaries while we're trying to create a loving environment where people find healing, find space to be themselves, find a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ, find these things together? And yet, on the one hand, we have abusers, and on the other hand, we have the abused. So how do we negotiate in the midst of that?
You know, this concept of boundaries is really such a very fundamental issue. We are inclined to define ourselves in relation to the boundaries which we may or may not cross. You know, so we have national boundaries. You know, I'm originally from Jamaica. John is originally from India, and so on. You know, so we have boundary locations. Or we have geographical locations with boundaries. And then when you consider the conflicts that have existed throughout the world, how many of those conflicts are created because of the moving of boundaries? How many of the problems that are associated with the redesign of land? And I think, for example, of the situation in trying to get your head around how things are, say, like in a large country like Nigeria, in West Africa, how the politics that led to the division and what that meant for relationships with people. And then you come to Northern Ireland and you realize that one of the fundamental acts as a way of attempting to resolve what was a pre-existing crisis about the ownership of space was to create a boundary, create a border. And so we have the border north and south. And then now if we focus on Northern Ireland only, one of the phenomena which we see is how we have geographical locations and almost boundary lines between the communities. So there is a sense in which you can cross over into the other community because there's an imagined or understood boundary. Now, one of the benefits that I have had as a migrant is that I have learned to soft pedal this question of boundary and realize how very liberating it is not to have to be preoccupied with a boundary. So where I live now in Northern Ireland, I do not conceive of it as being in or out of anywhere. It just is. Although I happen to believe that some of my neighbors will consider that it is of a certain character, but I don't conceive it that way. I just exist. I do not operate it with a boundary. So this idea of being able to free oneself a certain boundary can be liberating. How necessary are the boundaries that we create? I do have a particular problem with how states have insisted on some of the immigration policies which are predicated on those who are inside or outside. It just doesn't sit well with me philosophically or ethically or even morally. But you know, it's the law in some place. So learning to let go of boundaries, to free oneself of the boundaries we put around ourselves, it's so important. And so for communities here in Northern Ireland, and this is related to Nicola's, the earlier view that Nicola spoke of about the whole idea of welcome. When we welcome someone, we're essentially saying, disregard the boundary. Disregard the boundary, because don't regard yourself now as an outsider. Regard yourself as belonging. So the boundary does not apply to you. And I wonder what difference would it make if communities in Northern Ireland, if individuals in Northern Ireland would have such security of tenure in their own existence that the question of boundaries no longer, whether there can be the kind of a confidence to soft pedal this question of boundary mentally or physically on the ground.
Thank you.
I would just like to really support that and say, again, thinking of the unique church contribution in this context, how a scripture-based vision really underlines and underpins everything that Livingstone just said, and that's something that's at the heart of the particular kind of welcome that a church community offers. And when I was listening to your original question, Jared, I was thinking, you know, really at the heart of that is the role of the church, and in particular people in ministry, in the work of reconciliation and supporting individuals in their journey to be reconciled with God and with one another. And I suppose in terms of the support and advice that we can offer to people in ministry around that, I mean, one of the first things that comes through time and time again in our experience here in Northern Ireland is that the work of reconciliation is messy and it's uncomfortable, and it's really important to communicate that to people at the outset, because sometimes people can step forward to be peacemakers with really unrealistic expectations of what the work is going to be like, and really unrealistic expectations on themselves. And so first of all, in terms of the messiness of the context, I mean, it's not possible always to divide people nice and neatly into the victims and the perpetrators, and people may have suffered in one context and caused suffering in another. And then also for the people who are trying to lead and facilitate and guide those conversations, we all bring our own baggage, our own history. We all have been shaped by our own backgrounds, bring our own prejudices in there as well. So we can't have unrealistic expectations of ourselves. We're all flawed human beings seeking to navigate this, and there's a strength in being honest about that vulnerability in terms of setting the context for the conversation. And so there's a need to practice some self-compassion there too, and, you know, be reasonable and realistic in our expectations of ourselves and what we bring and what we can hope to achieve.
I'd simply add, sorry, Jared, were you going to say something? I'm happy to pause.
One second. I was just going to say that personally, as a minister, I oftentimes feel the burden of the question of, am I being courageous enough? Am I proclaiming loudly enough the gospel? And so hearing you say, be kind to it's messier than you believe, and I appreciate that personally from my own perspective. So thank you. Sorry, John.
No, you're fine, actually. Thank you for offering that. I mean, I'd first want to just simply address the clergy, right? As clergy, one clergy to another. Being clergy is no joke. I mean, it's not a joke. It's a calling. It's a very deep calling. It's a profound calling, and it's a hard calling. Precisely because, like you said, Jared, there's a vast array of people that we are responsible for, that we are spiritually responsible for, right? These are persons with names and histories and stories, and yet there are real differences, right? And yet there are real differences, and there may be differences that we are on board with. There may be differences that we strongly disagree with, and yet we are clergy, we are pastors, right? So I'd first use a word that we've all heard many times, is just self-care, in the sense that we do need to care for ourselves in ways that are healthy. So I'd say, as clergy, we need to begin small, right? The global contexts are just so overwhelming. But actually, one of the gifts of our time, I believe, is that we actually have microcosms of the world today in particular local spots. So we actually don't need to travel to far distances to meet people who are different from us. A gift of our time today is that we encounter people who are different from us in more ways than one: gender, sex, race, name it, right? That are actually pretty local. So I'd say begin small, begin local. As fellow clergy, let's make efforts to reach out across the divide, to create friendships, to sustain friendships, to nourish friendships across all kinds of differences. And I feel like that would actually give us a very realistic picture of what's possible. This is to go back to what Nicola was saying, right? That sometimes our expectations for ourselves, for our congregations and the world are just so larger than life. And yet I think the place where the rubber meets the road, as it were, is this thing called embodiment, right? Is this thing called embodiment. All our talk needs to be embodied in certain ways. So I feel like the first step for clergy is to create, sustain and nourish friendships across various kinds of differences within local contexts. Because if those friendships are actually authentic and have any integrity in them, they will actually enable us to have a very hard look at ourselves and others, and make that embodiment something that is actually worthwhile, that we can bring into conversation with our congregation members. Because when that is absent, our conversation with congregation members or other folks just becomes a little bit superficial, because it still revolves in the area of rhetoric and not embodiment, right? And I'd say we really need to hold on to some of our scriptural resources too. I feel like Christians have inherited rich spiritual resources that we often don't think about as much, because it again revolves around the area of rhetoric, right? Think about Galatians 3:28, right? For there is no longer Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave or free, right? We are so used to saying this, right? I'm so used to saying this. Many clergy are so used to saying this. But if you pause for a little bit and think, what's happening here? Oh my God, what might it mean to actually believe that there's no male or female, right? Or let's think, okay, if these boundaries, right, now to use Livingstone's word, if these boundaries are collapsed, what does that mean for Christian identity? What would it mean? And as a matter of fact, many people think that Galatians 3:28 is something that Paul came up with, right? Actually, Galatians 3:28 is not something that Paul came up with. So it's not like clergy top-down kind of formula. This was actually a baptismal formula that people in their acts of baptism actually told each other. So Paul was in fact citing a baptismal formula. This is what Christians actually told each other in the act of baptism. Hey, you know what? When we come together as Christians, there are real deep differences, antagonisms that persist. And yet our calling is to transcend those boundaries and to live a common life that constantly transcends the boundaries, right? So saying that neither nor doesn't mean that these differences just simply go away. But actually there is a sense of vocation, a sense of being called to work towards a world where these differences are less important than what bind us together, right? And think about another one. I'll just give one more scriptural reference, right? That this is in Luke, what is it? I believe 13, maybe, chapter, where it says, you know, people will come from the east and the west and the north and south and dine at the table of the Lord, right? And yet, oftentimes in our churches or in our local political bodies, right, outside churches, we often see people who are exactly like us, who sound like us, eat like us, speak like us. And I'm thinking to myself, where did that north, south, east, west theological affirmation go? if we are constantly hanging out with people who look like us and talk like us and, feel like us and think like us, we're not really getting to any place that's helpful, right? So I feel like there are so many traditions that Christians have inherited from scripture that we need to hold on to and embody in ways that we have not, and simply think that we can't just think that we are doing these things. We have to embody these things. So that would be one particular thing I'd say to clergy, to start first, embody it in our own lives, and that bring that into conversation with our congregations and with our local community.
So as we're coming to a close, unfortunately we're out of time. From what I have gathered from this conversation is that as an individual, as a minister, the best things that I can be doing are to take stock of who I am in my context, as my own person, my own baggage, my own history. Take a look around me, a serious look around where I am in this culture, in this reality, and start paying attention to the others that don't look like me, that aren't exactly like me, or really take stock in what is here and how I am reacting to them. And then listen to other stories, listen and share my own story. Would that be, in sum, would that be a good way to start the process of thinking about discrimination, intolerance, and racism within a local context?
I spoke a bit, so I'd rather have Livingstone and Nicola have some final words there.
Well, maybe just a simple nugget of encouragement. There's a certain learning to develop default responses so that it becomes effortless is very important. And I the things that cause the least stress are the things that we do effortlessly. We do it; it just happens. So, and what I'd say, certainly from my own role as minister, the times that I have the greatest sense of stress is where what I am preaching and what I'm practicing, there's a disconnect. Okay, so it's stressful. So I now have to exercise not only mental but other organizational energy to then do what is not happening in an automatic and almost a default way. So I just say to brothers and sisters in the Lord, it makes a lot of difference to practice what you preach, because when you practice what you're preaching, it's then effortless, it's less stressful, and so just to work hard at that, I'd say.
Thank you.
In my final thought, I'd just really like to echo what John has said around friendship. I think in our peace process, we have seen the value in friendships, some really iconic friendships across political divides, religious divides, traditional boundaries, in bringing people together, and also right down to the local level. And I think there's a risk that people sometimes undervalue the significance and the benefits of that. It's one of the easiest places to start. It's one of the best ways to cross and start to break down those boundaries. And I think if people take that away as a message, just of affirmation of the simple benefits of friendship, basic hospitality, and just appreciation of each other.
Thank you, Nicola. No more final words, John?
I just very much appreciated this conversation, Jared and Nicola and Livingstone. I'm grateful for it, and I'm better for it. So thank you.
Well, thank you all very, very much. This is an incredibly difficult topic. It's a challenging topic. It's a broad topic. We've only begun to look beneath the surface of it. There are many, many more conversations that can be had and should be had and must be had in the years to come. We are going to, when we post this video on the Facebook page, we'll also append a list of resources. John especially mentioned several books, and I'm sure that we'll have links to those so that if you wish to do further reading or further research into this, there will be opportunities. Also, if anybody who's watching this video feels that they would like to continue a conversation in this vein, please be in contact with the Care4Clergy member, and we'll love to hook up with a conversation, a group, and whatever we need to do to keep this conversation going. So thank you all again, and goodbye.